Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Outcomes Rocket podcast. I'm excited to have today's episode. Pharmaceutical companies build deep pipelines, and then they find their own products competing. Same disease area, same sales team, rivalry really down the hall instead of across town. And today's episode is part of our series with Lumanity on building pharma brands that win, commercial success in pharma. I have the privilege of speaking with Jakub, Kaczor, and also Peter Smith of Lumanity on portfolio co-positioning today and why R&D first cultures breed internal rivalry and how process, narrative, and incentives can keep a portfolio working as one. Excited to have both of you guys on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so let's get started with some quick intros. Talk to us about yourself and maybe and what you do at Lumanity. Why don't we start with you, Jakub?
Sure, thank you, So yeah, my name is Jakub. I am a vice president at Lumanity. I'm part of the asset and organizational strategy consulting team. And actually, both myself and Peter, we work with pharma and biotech companies, navigating a variety of strategic challenges, including goals related to portfolio. So yeah, it's great to be here.
Pleasure to have you, Jakub. Peter?
Yeah, so as Jakub said, I also work in the consulting part of Lumanity in the EU. I'm a senior vice president there, working with a range of biotech and pharma companies.
Love it. Well, thank you, Peter, for joining us as well. And so to kick things off, I feel like it's good to level set. Talk to us about what portfolio co-positioning is.
Yeah, that's a good opening question. As I think different companies refer to this in different ways. What we mean by portfolio positioning or portfolio co-positioning is the situation where you have two or more assets in the same disease area, and you need to accurately position those two assets to maximize the opportunity and to avoid internal competition.
Well, that's certainly a big challenge. And so I'm glad we're having this conversation. Let's talk about it. You know, why is it such a critical issue for commercial teams today?
Yes, I think, there are a variety of reasons. Before I get to them, I think I'd like to start with a bit of a paradox. And I think that's something that surprises people every time. The more disciplined a company R&D strategy is, the more likely it is to end up competing with itself in the markets. Companies, they do focus their discovery and development efforts on carefully selected therapy areas. And that's very smart, right? That's what they should be doing. They do accumulate science, IP, clinical expertise. And the natural outcome of that focus is a succession of assets in the same space. That's great for patients, right? That's what drives innovation. But commercially, that creates a genuinely difficult challenge. How do you co-position and, more importantly, promote two or more products in the same therapy area?
No, I was going to say there are some real risks of getting it wrong as well. If you don't accurately co-position your products, you can end up with, well, to be honest, a failure to maximize the commercial potential of the portfolio. That also means that you're not necessarily having the reach that you want with the patients that you want to get to. You can easily confuse HCPs, and you can learn and other stakeholders, and you can also sort of lead to internal competition. So there's some real risks of getting this wrong. And as Jakub will probably describe later, the journey to getting this right needs to start early in development. But when you get it right, to focus on the positive, you conversely have the opportunity to maximize your portfolio, occupy a position potentially in a disease or therapy area which is competitively strong, respected by customers, and one that maximizes, say, your patient coverage. But it's quite a journey to get there sometimes. It's not a straightforward process, as we'll describe.
Definitely. Yeah. And so it's, it's difficult. And so why, with all these kind of different, sometimes you feel like it would be clear, but why is it difficult to get it right?
So I think, I think companies are under enormous pressure to bring follow-on assets to market, and they have to do it faster than ever before. Sort of if you think about patent cliffs, right? Sort of a lot of revenue is expected to be lost. There was this article I've read the other day from Evaluate that stated that big pharma is on the edge of a patent cliff by 2030 that could strip away the $300 billion worth of revenue. And that's sort of like a sixth of the overall revenue that the industry is generating, right? So the pressure is there. And, we see this across some of the most prominent names in the industry. You've got the likes of AbbVie in immunology, Novo Nordisk in diabetes, Johnson & Johnson, multiple myeloma. All of these companies have faced exactly this challenge in terms of, having more assets, multiple assets in the same therapy area. And, I think it's fair to say, with differing degrees of success. I think the timing question it's a really important one. And honestly, I think most companies come to this at launch or post-launch, when they can see the problem very clearly. And, ideally, you should begin thinking about co-positioning during development, because if you think about this, you're in a position where you can choose what patients to target in your studies, right? You can select endpoints. You could decide what sort of a label language to pursue, and by the time assets are launched, those degrees of freedom are largely gone. Actually, you can't sort of unravel some of the clinical development choices you have done earlier. So the earlier the better, I think is the answer here in terms of timing.
Yeah, agreed. And I think if that's done well, then companies will arrive at a situation where their assets are to some degree automatically distinct, because, as we've just been hearing, endpoints are different, the studies are different, the indications are different. So if you arrive at a situation where one of your drugs is only going to be indicated, let's say, in second or third line, then that makes it very easy to distinguish and co-position versus an asset which you have in that area, which is first line, just to use a simple example. So you're not always left with a difficult problem, but there are many cases where companies find themselves in a situation where they've got 2 or 3 assets on the market which they need to actually sort out and make sure they're not internally competing. And some of those assets may be about to launch, others may be on the market. And there, really, it's an issue of what segments of patients do we target and how do we work that out to the best benefit of each asset and the portfolio overall. And that's a little bit of a process to go through, but very worthwhile to realize the benefits of having a strong portfolio in a particular area with all the advantages that brings.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, as you guys say, if those indications are different, disease areas are different, it's a lot easier. But if they're the same disease area, that's where it gets tough, right? That's where it gets difficult to really make this happen. So how can companies get this right?
In my experience, right, co-positioning efforts, when they fail, right, they don't fail because the strategy is difficult. Quite often they fail because teams rush through things. There's a structured way through this. And when it goes wrong, quite often is either because, the analysis, the process wasn't grounded in market reality, or brand teams lacked objectivity, because they were attached to their own assets' success. Or, and that's a big one, they worked in silos, they never actually sat in the same room and went through the process together. And when it comes to co-positioning, you're dealing with quite often with big brands, big revenue streams. You cannot sort of develop a co-positioning strategy if you don't do this together. So I think these are some of the prerequisites, I think, that are worth keeping in mind. But I know, Peter, you've got also the process as well.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, I completely agree, by the way, that the collaborative mindset is absolutely essential. And probably a bit later, we'll talk about the importance of way you structure the organization, incentives, and things that would support that collaboration. But as Jakub also sort of hinted, you need a really good market-led, customer need-led process to get there, and one which is very objective, systematic in its search for patient segments and the way that they are identified as being of particular interest to your different assets. I mean, very briefly, I don't want to spend 15 minutes describing a sort of ethereal process in the air, but very briefly, I think one of the first things one needs to do is understand the strategic priority of different assets. And of course, part of that is the work you're going to do in looking at segments that they target, and that certainly informs the strategic priority. But very often companies have a sense of what is important because of different reasons, LOE, follow-on assets, things like that. So that needs, I think, to be surfaced pretty quickly if that's going to help steer the decision. And that'll be important later when we start to think about where there's a choice to be made about which segment different assets would target. But that's a little bit later. I think one of the first things one needs to do is really understand the market incredibly well and objectively. And we tend to use a process in which we look at market structure, which is a visual map of how different sets of patients or patients with different needs are treated and why. Because in any disease or therapy area, pretty much, you're not going to see patients universally treated in the same way. And the reason is they have different needs and they end up on different products. And we all know that. But it's always a little bit surprising that quite a lot of people don't absolutely understand what patient segments exist in the market and how that leads to different treatment. Once you've done that, then you can do things like size those segments. You can look at the attractiveness of those segments. And of course, one of the important components of attractiveness is how well each of your assets meet the needs in that particular segment of the patient and of the other stakeholders, obviously the ACP who are treating it. And once you have that, you have an objective assessment of where those different assets should be positioned and which are the attractive segments that you want to go for. And you can go through a process in which you look at the positioning of the assets in those respective segments. Of course, the real challenge is when there's an overlap. When you look at your map and you say, well, asset A and B needs to target this group of patients, how do you resolve that? And then other things come into play, like commercial considerations, strategic priorities, as I said at the beginning. But fundamentally, what we're describing is a market and needs-led assessment that intuitively leads to different assets being positioned relative to each other, distinct to each other in different patient segments. Now, there are other ways to do it. You can look at ACP segmentation. You can look at different commercial channels in certain countries. But fundamentally, for us, the decision is which patient are we going to target with which asset and why.
At the end of the day, that's the end goal, right? Making sure you have the right patient to therapy alignment. So I love this frame that you've given us, Peter, this strategy and this kind of how to look at it, the landscape. How do we translate those strategic choices into executable tactical plans? You know, and I'll highlight, we've had some really great discussions in the show notes. We'll reference building a pharma launch engine that drives competitive advantage. Like we've got some really good stuff on pharma launch that we've done in previous episodes. But like as it relates to co-positioning, right? How do we execute these into tactical plans?
Yeah, so I think so. This is a big topic, right? Because having a perfectly designed co-positioning strategy is a one thing. Executing is entirely another, right? That's completely something different. And Peter, you've sort of mentioned mindset, right? I think that's having the right mindset is one of the most important elements as it shapes how teams collaborate, right? And co-positioning execution of co-positioning strategy, it is a lot about collaboration. I think, the enemy of a portfolio approach is a strong brand ego. When portfolio brands are positioning in silos or think as individual teams without considering the portfolio lens, I think it's very likely that this will create, competition between brands. And ultimately, right, confuse your customers, prescribers, payers, you name it. So I think the mindset, having the right mindset, collaborative mindset is absolutely critical. One way to mitigate that is to have a portfolio owner, someone that will explicitly sort of own the franchise, not just defend one asset, but sort of look after the portfolio, And this could be a person or a function. I've seen both, but without having, that person or function in place, I think the pool of individual brand P&Ls is likely to always win.
Yeah, there's got to be an aggregator, right? Somebody that aggregates it and directs it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a balance in there, of course, and it's not completely straightforward. I mean, each brand has to win in its own positioning, and and that requires a degree of brand focus, of course, and you need people who are focused on the brand. But the environment, as Jakub has been saying, is such that you need to ensure that people are thinking portfolio as well. So that things like incentives, in our opinion, can't necessarily be entirely focused on brand success. They have to be on portfolio maximization in order to encourage that sort of collaborative behavior. And also, as Jakub mentioned, there may be implications for structure as well, because you can structure the organization so that you have separate brand leads, and if you like, a hierarchy above that. But at some point, somebody needs to be thinking from a therapy area point of view or portfolio point of view and saying, this is how the customer is going to see us. One small thing, incidentally, as we think about the need to have very distinct messaging and positioning for each asset so that they don't overlap and don't confuse the medical community, is you should be able to write your positioning down for each asset on either side of a slide and perhaps accompanying messages. And you should be able to see the differences, and it should be clear to everybody. And if it's not clear to everybody, it's absolutely not going to be clear to the people who are going to really make the difference in the field when it comes to the commercial success of the portfolio and each asset. So there is just a need for unerring clarity so that, as we said, we can realize the benefits of a true portfolio proposition. And then, of course, further downstream, one can think about, once one knows where the assets are going to be co-positioned relative to each other, one can think about the overall portfolio proposition in which one assumes or tries to assume a leadership position for that particular disease area. And many companies have done that very successfully with benefits downstream, if you like, an inferred favorability, if you like, the things that they're going to launch in the future, because they've done such a good job at establishing themselves with credibility in that disease area. So that, if you like, is the icing on the cake for the portfolio, but a very important layer of icing, actually.
Icing on the cake, or I think of this as a roof of the house. Once the individual assets are clearly positioned relative to each other, you build that overarching narrative, which basically brings everything together and frames the direction for the tactical plans and messaging. And really, if you do this well, the risk of ending up with the disjointed tactical plans leading to confusion in the marketplace, substantially go down. So yeah, very critical.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, well said, guys. And so ultimately, having that clarity, that mindset, those incentives, and the structure. But ultimately, that I like the kind of either side of the slide thing. Keep it so simple that you could drive this thing and all the pieces work together. If you're out there listening to this podcast and you find yourself in this situation, you're probably wondering, wow, I'm in this right now. I'm in the thick of it. This one's for you. And a question that I want to ask Jakub and Peter, what is the most important shift for teams to make when approaching portfolio positioning?
I think it depends where they are, obviously. And I think there's companies that are very good at this. But I would say the two most important things are, firstly, to understand the market and in some depth where the opportunities are. so that one can make an objective assessment about where each asset would naturally play. I think that's absolutely a must do. And I think the second thing is engendering a spirit of collaboration and objectivity, and a way of working with all the supporting things that we've talked about that is going to drive a mindset of, yes, we focus on brand success, but we are also focused on maximizing portfolio success. So I think, in summary, a market-led approach to the assessment of the opportunity, and secondly, collaborative mindset.
Yeah, that's great, Peter. I would add two others, actually. Making the organizational design decision before you start the process. Who owns the portfolio, right? If you don't have a clear answer to that before you begin, I can almost guarantee that the strategic output will be undermined by internal politics. I've seen this so many times. So I think that governance decision needs to be taken early. And another big one for me is, always build for the future competitive landscape, not the present one. We tend to look at the next 3 to 5 years. I think 3 years is easier to plan for because it's less uncertain. But across many therapeutic areas these days, the competitive environment changes so quickly. New modalities, new biosimilars, new mode of actions are being introduced. So if you are positioned for today's landscape, it's very likely that in a couple of months' time, what you've done is completely obsolete. Yeah, always build for the future.
Well said. And I love that. It's easy to plan for now, but doing it a few years in advance, that 3 to 5 year frame, to help stay ahead of it. This has been a fascinating discussion, gentlemen. I feel like we could do another 2 parts to this episode. Unfortunately, we are here at the end. If there's folks out there wanting to continue the discussion or learn more, what call to action would you give them, and how could they find you and the team at Lumanity?
Well, I think if people are looking at their portfolio and wondering whether the co-positioning is truly correct, or if they have that challenge on the horizon, then certainly myself, Jakub, and other people at Lumanity would be very happy to help. So please do contact us. We have a lot of experience in managing these sorts of situations and collaborating with companies to try and get the best outcome we can. We lived and breathed this on many occasions, including some of us who worked in the industry and had this very problem ourselves. So we have a good process. I'm very happy to help.
Yeah, what I would add, we have written a number of white papers related to portfolio co-positioning, but also other parts of strategic planning process that actually are of huge relevance to what we've discussed today. Things like segmentation, positioning, brand narratives are all really relevant. So we'll make sure to include links to those as part of this podcast. And I would encourage everyone to have a look.
Thank you so much for that, gentlemen. Everyone, thanks for joining us today. In the show notes, you're going to find all the ways to get in touch with the Lumanity team, a link to the broader session, and ways to get in touch with Jakub and Peter on this topic of co-positioning. And the white papers will be there too. So make sure you check out the show notes. Thank you all for spending time with us. And Peter, Jakub, thank you both for sharing your expertise on today's episode.
Thank you so much. Enjoyed it.